The Glamour Illusion. 14 horrific physical secrets Hollywood buried alive. Step right up and look closely past the dazzling blinding lights of the golden age. Have you ever wondered what horrific, terrifying prices were actually paid for the absolute cinematic immortality we worship today? Beyond the perfectly tailored suits, the radiant, flawless smiles, and the pristine, glamorous red carpets, a deeply sinister reality was systematically buried by ruthless studio executives. These are the agonizing, blood-chilling physical secrets that Hollywood's most legendary icons were violently forced to hide from an adoring public. Imagine being the absolute, undisputed king of the global box office while secretly rotting from within, or soaring as America's beloved sweetheart while being pumped full of lethal amphetamines just to survive an agonizing 18-hour shift. This is not the beautiful fairy tale you were sold. This is a brutal, blood-stained ledger of extreme suffering. Get ready, because we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtain to completely expose the tragic, highly guarded medical nightmares of 14 monumental stars whose bodies were ultimately destroyed by the very industry that crowned them. Katharine Hepburn. She was a towering, defiant titan of cinema, a fiercely independent woman who aggressively wore trousers before it was socially acceptable and ruthlessly dictated the absolute terms of her own staggering career. Securing 4 Academy Awards and establishing an unparalleled legacy, she projected an aura of unshakable confidence. But behind the highly tailored blazers and the intensely fierce glare, her nervous system was actively betraying her. Starting in her early 30s, she began to battle an essential tremor, a progressive, incurable neurological condition that caused her head and hands to shake with uncontrollable, terrifying frequency. In a vicious industry that equated the slightest physical vulnerability with terminal weakness, admitting to a neurological disorder would have instantly ended her reign. Instead, she executed a brilliant, decades-long campaign of absolute misdirection. She aggressively engineered her wardrobe to conceal her suffering, demanding high-necked collars and forcing designers to sew deep pockets into every single costume so she could aggressively anchor her trembling, hands out of sight. Most incredibly, she fundamentally altered her entire vocal delivery. That famous, rapidly clipped, highly aristocratic cadence she was so widely known for was actually a desperate survival mechanism. Speaking in fast, sharp bursts was the only way she could effectively mask the constant shaking of her jaw and vocal cords. She completely withdrew from public dining and major social events, deeply terrified that holding a teacup would immediately expose her agonizing secret. Studio bosses occasionally weaponized her condition, subtly threatening to expose her if she demanded too much control. Yet, she aggressively outsmarted them all, turning her own terrifying medical symptoms into an iconic Oscar-winning brand. Her absolute refusal to surrender to her failing anatomy cemented her forever as the ultimate matriarch of American film, proving true strength lies in mastering your own deepest vulnerabilities in the face of an unforgiving spotlight. James Stewart. Before the outbreak of World War II, he was the quintessential, folksy boy next door, a highly bankable star whose effortlessly smooth, lanky strides charmed millions in classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But when he returned from the brutal European theater in 1945, he was fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Unlike actors who merely played soldiers on a soundstage, he actually lived the nightmare, bravely piloting 20 terrifying combat missions through skies completely saturated with lethal Nazi anti-aircraft fire. He survived, but a piece of him was permanently left behind. He returned home suffering from severe nerve damage in his right leg, resulting in a highly pronounced visible limp. For a studio system entirely obsessed with the flawless physical perfection of its leading men, a disabled war hero was considered absolutely unmarketable. Instead of honoring his immense sacrifice, executives violently panicked. They aggressively forced him into highly painful, grueling physical therapy sessions, designed not to heal his shattered nerves, but to forcefully mask his injury. Directors were given incredibly strict orders to entirely obscure his lower half. They meticulously choreographed his scenes so he was heavily leaning on furniture, entirely seated, or walking incredibly slowly through dark shadows. The profound, hollow exhaustion burning in his eyes during the filming of It's a Wonderful Life was not brilliant acting. It was the manifestation of intense physical pain and deep, unaddressed PTSD. Hollywood aggressively demanded that he smile and perform, ruthlessly burying the physical scars of his genuine heroism just to protect their polished, profitable fantasy. His towering cinematic legacy, as the ultimate American everyman, was built on a foundation of silent, agonizing physical sacrifice that the industry desperately wanted the world to ignore. Clark Gable. He was the undisputed king of Hollywood, the absolute zenith of rugged American masculinity. Armed with a devil-may-care smirk and a razor-sharp jawline, his undeniable magnetism drove millions of women utterly wild and fundamentally defined the golden age of the box office. However, the meticulously crafted illusion of his flawless perfection ended the second he opened his mouth. By the time he was barely into his early 30s, years of severe, deeply neglected gum disease and rampant infections had completely destroyed his natural dental structure. The studio ruthlessly ordered a total, agonizing extraction, outfitting their premier sex symbol with a complete set of uncomfortable, poorly fitted porcelain dentures. The reality of his condition was a highly guarded, humiliating secret. The prosthetic teeth caused chronic, deeply painful mouth ulcers and agonizing nerve pain. The infections constantly festering beneath the fake gums led to severe, inescapable halitosis. His legendary romantic scenes were often a literal nightmare for his co-stars. Vivian Leigh famously complained about his breath during Gone with the Wind, while Joan Crawford would aggressively dab potent peppermint oil directly under her nose just to survive their intimate close-ups. Sound technicians had to work overtime to mask a faint, distinct whistling noise his dentures produced whenever he delivered his lines. The immense psychological toll of this secret completely eroded his immense confidence. Off-camera, the man who swaggered across the screen with absolute dominance would silently soak his teeth in a bathroom glass, desperately terrified of being exposed as a fraud. He lived in constant, agonizing fear that the public would discover the ultimate alpha male was actually suffering in deeply humiliating silence. He carried the unbearable weight of this gross insecurity to his grave forever, terrified of losing his crown to a mere dental disaster. Judy Garland. When audiences first watched the sparkling, innocent farm girl skip down the yellow brick road in 1939's The Wizard of Oz, they witnessed cinematic magic. What they did not see was the profound orthopedic pain meticulously hidden beneath those iconic, sequined ruby slippers. From her earliest days as a child prodigy, she was forced into a grueling battle against her own anatomy. She suffered from a severe physical imbalance. One of her legs was noticeably shorter than the other. To completely mask this perceived imperfection, MGM executives mandated that custom orthopedic inserts be jammed into her footwear. Every single choreographed dance routine, every twirl, and every skip sent terrifying shocks of pain radiating up into her hips and spine. But a structural deformity was merely the beginning of her silent torture. Because her frame was naturally sturdy, and the studio demanded an impossibly waifish aesthetic, executives subjected her to a highly toxic, supervised regimen of extreme dieting and powerful vitamin injections. These so-called vitamins were actually heavy amphetamines designed to brutally suppress her appetite and force her to work punishing 18-hour shifts without sleep. When the cameras stopped rolling, she was fed powerful barbiturates just so her exhausted body could finally power down. Behind the breathtaking, generational voice that could easily bring thousands of grown adults to tears was a terrified teenager physically buckling under the immense weight of a billion-dollar industry. She was completely trapped in a devastating cycle of chemically induced energy and chronic joint pain, relentlessly mocked by studio bosses as the fat one. Her brilliant smile was essentially a masterclass in pain management, built on a scaffolding of secret agony that would ultimately cost her her life. The industry that celebrated her genius systematically and ruthlessly engineered her complete physical and psychological destruction for profit. Bela Lugosi. When he descended the grand staircase in 1931, wrapped heavily in a sweeping black cape, he didn't just portray a vampire. He permanently burned the image of Dracula into the global cultural consciousness. Audiences were utterly paralyzed by his incredibly stiff, terrifyingly deliberate movements and his wide, unblinking, hypnotic stare. What they completely failed to realize was that they were watching a man working through absolutely excruciating physical agony before achieving Hollywood immortality. He had served in the brutal trenches of World War I. He endured devastating injuries on the freezing Russian front, catching shrapnel that left him with severe, permanent nerve damage and agonizing sciatica in his lower back. The iconic, incredibly slow gait of the legendary Count wasn't a masterclass in theatrical blocking. It was the absolute maximum speed his shattered spine would allow him to walk without collapsing in pure agony. That terrifying, soul-piercing stare was actually the result of extreme, uncorrected nearsightedness. Because he could not wear his thick prescription glasses while filming, he was essentially acting blind, aggressively straining his eyes just to locate the other actors on the dark soundstage. To survive the grueling, highly demanding production schedules, he heavily turned to powerful painkillers, ultimately triggering a tragic, decades-long battle with severe morphine addiction. The studios entirely exploited his agonizing pain, aggressively marketing his genuine physical stiffness as supernatural menace. He became completely trapped inside the monster he created, a deeply suffering veteran slowly being consumed by the very industry that worshipped his darkness. For decades, the public viewed him as the ultimate incarnation of the undead, completely blind to the fact that the real horror was the brutal, unmedicated physical torture he endured every single time the cameras rolled. Lon Chaney. He is fundamentally remembered as the absolute, undisputed master of macabre cinema, an incredibly brilliant artist, universally dubbed the Man of a Thousand Faces. In an era long before the massive convenience of highly advanced CGI, he physically, aggressively mutated his own body to completely become the horrifying creatures he portrayed. However, the incredible, absolute horror of his characters completely paled in comparison to the immense, terrifying torture he voluntarily inflicted upon his own anatomy. To completely achieve the highly grotesque, incredibly famous silhouette of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, he aggressively strapped a massive 70-pound leather and steel apparatus directly to his spine. The immense crushing weight of the fake hump completely contorted his ribcage, aggressively restricting his breathing to the point where he would frequently violently vomit blood into a bucket between massive takes. For the Phantom of the Opera, his absolute dedication bordered on sheer madness. He completely inserted sharp, highly dangerous wires deep into his nasal cavity to forcefully rip his nostrils open, aggressively hooking sharp metal deep into his cheeks to aggressively pull his skin into a terrifying skeletal grimace. He poured highly toxic, burning chemicals directly into his eyes to make them appear completely blind, causing severe, terrifying, temporary vision loss. The incredibly sharp wires he used in London, after midnight, aggressively sliced his internal gums open, leading to a massive, terrifying bout of severe blood poisoning. His absolute refusal to compromise completely shattered his immune system, leading directly to his highly premature death from severe complications at just 47. He literally bled to death for the camera. His terrifying, pioneering genius secured his immortality, but the gruesome physical cost transformed his own body into a sacrificial altar for early Hollywoods. insatiable hunger for the grotesque. Montgomery Clift. Long before the brooding rebels of the mid-century took over the screen, he completely redefined the parameters of the Hollywood leading man. He possessed a breathtaking, highly sensitive, and almost unbelievably symmetrical facial structure that made the camera absolutely fall in love with him. He was a deeply intense, immensely talented method actor who brought raw, bleeding vulnerability to incredibly massive hits like From Here to Eternity. However, his devastatingly beautiful world was violently, completely obliterated in the dark, early morning hours of 1956. While driving home from a highly exclusive party hosted by his close friend Elizabeth Taylor, he viciously crashed his car head-on into a massive stone wall in Beverly Hills. The sheer, terrifying impact completely crushed his nose, entirely shattered his cheekbones, and snapped his jaw in half. Taylor heroically had to manually extract broken teeth from his throat just to stop him from choking to death on his own blood. Surgeons desperately scrambled to reconstruct his perfect face using heavy metal wiring and massive plates, but the absolute magic was permanently destroyed. When he finally returned to complete filming Raintree County, the tragic difference was utterly shocking. His face was deeply paralyzed on the left side, his smile was agonizingly stiff, and his eyes appeared profoundly deadened by extreme trauma. The intense, chronic physical pain of his shattered skull completely pushed him over the edge into a severe, lethal dependency on alcohol and heavy painkillers. The industry quietly watched in horror as their most gorgeous property initiated what became famously known as the longest, most agonizing suicide in Hollywood history. The vibrant, beautiful star that captured a generation was completely reduced to a broken shell, endlessly tortured by the ghosts of his own former reflection. Harold Lloyd. He was the brilliant, bespectacled architect of thrill comedy, an incredibly fearless daredevil, who routinely risked his own life to secure a massive laugh. His iconic 1923 masterpiece, Safety Last, features one of the most famous, utterly terrifying shots in cinema history, a man desperately dangling from the hands of a massive clock face, 10 stories directly above the unforgiving concrete of Los Angeles. The sheer terror of that stunt is magnified 1,000 times by a secret the studio guarded with military precision. He executed that death-defying climb with only one fully functioning hand. 4 years earlier, an incredibly horrific accident involving a highly explosive prop bomb completely blew off his right thumb and index finger, severely mangling the remaining tissue and nearly blinding him. Terrified that insurance companies would instantly blacklist a disabled stuntman, he completely hid the devastation. He commissioned a highly specialized, flesh-colored rubber prosthetic glove to meticulously hide the missing digits. The rubber severely chafed his sensitive skin raw, completely trapped his sweat, and left his entire hand entirely numb during highly dangerous physical sequences. Every time he launched his body onto a speeding train or aggressively scaled a towering building, he was literally gambling his life, entirely relying on a compromised grip. He absolutely refused to be relegated to the director's chair, fiercely doubling down on incredibly dangerous choreography just to prove he wasn't broken. His fans watched him conquer gravity, completely unaware that the man clinging to the ledge was actively fighting a terrifying daily war against his own mangled anatomy. He defied unimaginable physical limitations to become a silent era legend, weaponizing his own horrific trauma to generate timeless joy for millions who never knew his secret agony. Lionel Barrymore. As the highly revered patriarch of the legendary Barrymore acting dynasty, he was a massive, imposing theatrical force of nature. He possessed a booming, deeply authoritative voice and an incredibly dominant screen presence that easily, completely overshadowed his contemporaries. However, by the dawn of the 1930s, the incredibly proud towering titan was actively being reduced to an agonizing crawl. He was diagnosed with a highly aggressive, deeply crippling form of arthritis that violently twisted his joints and systematically destroyed his cartilage. This pure agony was further compounded by a severely improperly healed, broken hip, rendering him entirely unable to stand without experiencing mind-numbing pain. Rather than accommodating their prestigious star, MGM treated his debilitating disease as a massive, unacceptable inconvenience. They aggressively forced him to wear highly torturous, heavy steel and leather braces hidden underneath his tailored suits. He would endure absolutely grueling, massive shooting days, desperately pretending to stand strong, only to completely collapse in tears inside his dressing room, his skin heavily sliced open and bleeding from the sharp metal digging into his flesh. When the pain finally became totally insurmountable, he was permanently relegated to a wheelchair. The studio ruthlessly mandated that his massive disability be completely camouflaged. They aggressively forced directors to block him entirely behind large desks, heavy pianos, or massive bank counters, when he famously terrified audiences as the incredibly cruel Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. They saw a bitter man confined to a chair. They had absolutely no idea. They were watching a brilliant actor suffering through extreme, untreated physical agony, entirely trapped by an industry that completely erased his incredible physical struggle. His immense dignity and staggering talent ultimately outshone the cruel limitations forced upon him by a terrified studio system. Jean Tierney, with her highly striking, incredibly sharp cheekbones and luminous presence, she was completely universally hailed as one of the most exquisitely beautiful women ever captured on standard film. Her incredibly haunting, Oscar-nominated performance in Leave Her to Heaven cemented her absolute status as the ultimate untouchable Hollywood goddess. Yet, behind the completely flawless makeup and perfectly tailored couture, she was entirely navigating a terrifyingly silent obstacle course. She suffered from severe, deeply profound color blindness, making it entirely impossible for her to distinguish red from green. In the highly visual, intensely critical world of studio fashion, this was a massive, deeply humiliating handicap. She had to meticulously memorize the exact texture and hanger placement of her massive wardrobe, politely nodding when highly demanding designers aggressively questioned her about emerald gowns or crimson lipstick. However, her inability to see colors was absolutely nothing compared to the terrifying darkness consuming her mind. Under the crushing, deeply suffocating weight of intense studio demands and massive personal tragedies, she developed a severe, highly crippling case of bipolar disorder. When she finally suffered a massive, highly psychological break in the 1950s, the brutal medical interventions completely destroyed her career. She was violently subjected to dozens of horrific electroshock therapy sessions that fundamentally permanently damaged her short-term memory. The brilliant actress, who once flawlessly commanded pages of intense dialogue, could no longer remember a single line. She was aggressively forced to rely on hidden cue cards, watching in absolute terror as her own mind was systematically erased by the very doctors hired to save her. The ethereal beauty that completely captivated the globe became a prisoner of aggressive medical trauma, her brilliant mind fractured by an unforgiving pursuit of absolute perfection. Peter Lorre. Whenever a script demanded a deeply unsettling, highly unpredictable, and absolutely terrifying villain, the major studios instantly called this brilliant character actor. With his incredibly large, haunting eyes and high-pitched, heavily accented voice, he completely defined cinematic menace in absolute masterpieces like M and the Maltese Falcon. However, the highly distinct, deeply creepy, physical mannerisms that completely made him famous were not born from brilliant theatrical choices. They were the direct result of a highly painful, deeply debilitating physical deformity. He was born with completely misshapen, severely deformed feet that aggressively turned inward, resulting in a slightly awkward, painful, pigeon-toed limp. Rather than offering their massive star any sort of corrective medical support, Hollywood executives ruthlessly exploited his immense suffering. They completely typecast him as the ultimate cowardly, highly repulsive outcast. Costume designers were aggressively ordered to construct the unusual footwear just to hide the severity of the deformity. But the heavy, dragging limp remained totally visible. The massive psychological damage of being permanently pigeonholed as a complete grotesque deeply broke his spirit. Warner Brothers heavily abused his contract, aggressively underpaying him and completely sabotaging his deeply desperate attempts to direct his own projects or play romantic leads. The absolute exhaustion of dragging his deeply deformed body across massive sound stages, combined with the heavy emotional humiliation of extreme typecasting, ultimately drove him into a severe, highly destructive battle with chemical addiction. He spent his entire life desperately trying to prove he was a complex leading man, only to be entirely buried under the massive agonizing weight of a villainous caricature. His legendary screen presence was fundamentally rooted in a lifelong, heavily suppressed agony that the industry found vastly too profitable to ever attempt to heal. Mary Astor. She possessed the absolute, ultimate elegance of the classical cinematic era, flawlessly commanding the silver screen with a deeply crisp, highly intelligent delivery that completely destroyed her male co-stars. Winning an Academy Award and achieving absolute immortality as the highly elusive, incredibly dangerous femme fatale in The Maltese Falcon, she survived completely devastating early career scandals that would have instantly annihilated lesser talents. She incredibly successfully transitioned from a beautiful leading lady into a highly respected, heavily sought-after character actress. However, the absolute twilight of her massive, incredible life was marked by a deeply tragic, entirely invisible battle against her failing nervous system. In the deeply demanding, highly visible 1960s, she suffered a massive, completely devastating stroke that completely fundamentally altered her brilliant instrument. The crisp, heavily precise diction that made her incredibly famous was aggressively replaced by a highly uncontrollable, deep vocal tremor. Her incredibly expressive, deeply beautiful face suffered a highly noticeable slackness, completely robbing her of the subtle, microscopic micro-expressions that made her a genius. Deeply terrified of absolute public humiliation and aggressively proud of her incredible legacy, she completely withdrew from the entire world. She spent her final decades completely locked away in a highly modest retirement home, an absolute ghost of the massive glamour she once possessed. Her highly expressive, incredible eyes still darted with massive intelligence, completely trapped inside a body that entirely refused to obey her commands. She didn't complain, choosing to quietly, entirely fade into absolute silence, rather than let Hollywood witness the brutal, agonizing destruction of her physical grace. Her ferocious pride shielded her immense legacy, but forced her to endure her terrifying physical decline in absolute, deafening isolation. Merle Oberon. She was aggressively marketed to the global public as a highly exotic, incredibly mysterious, and completely flawless beauty originating from the pristine island of Tasmania. In reality, her entire public existence was an incredibly elaborate, deeply exhausting, and completely fabricated lie orchestrated to hide her true ethnicity. Born in Bombay to a highly impoverished Anglo-Indian mother, she absolutely knew that revealing her mixed-race heritage in the deeply racist, heavily segregated 1930s Hollywood system would instantly annihilate her career. She completely submitted to the studio's brutal demands, aggressively applying highly toxic, heavy skin-bleaching chemical creams to her face every single day, enduring massive rashes and severe chemical burns just to pass as fully white. The sheer, overwhelming psychological trauma of this lie was absolutely staggering. She famously refused to acknowledge her own Indian relatives when they joyfully approached her during a highly publicized trip, weeping deeply as she aggressively turned her back on her own blood. As if hiding her race wasn't exhausting enough, a completely devastating, near-fatal car crash in 1937 severely crushed her cheekbones and entirely severed vital facial nerves, leaving the left side of her face deeply scarred and partially paralyzed. Her cinematographer husband desperately invented a highly specialized lighting apparatus, famously dubbed the OB light, designed entirely to aggressively wash out her scars and mask the severe drooping. She lived in constant, absolute terror, aggressively hiding both her severely damaged face and her highly guarded heritage, trapped forever in a golden, terrifyingly fragile cage. The immense pressure of maintaining this entirely fabricated, excruciatingly painful existence haunted her until her final breath, cementing her legacy as a tragic victim of early cinema's ruthless beauty standards. Barbara Payton. She erupted onto the massive Hollywood scene like a highly volatile, completely unstoppable supernova. With incredibly sharp, stunning platinum blonde beauty and a completely undeniable, deeply dangerous screen presence, she was rapidly commanding an absolutely staggering $10,000 a week. She was the absolute darling of intense, gritty film noirs, aggressive, matching the intense energy of massive leading men like James Cagney. But her incredibly rapid ascent was completely matched by an absolutely horrifying, deeply tragic physical and psychological freefall. In the heavily chaotic, deeply turbulent mid-1950s, she reportedly suffered a completely devastating, extremely violent fall down a massive flight of solid concrete stairs. The terrifying impact completely shattered her spine, heavily crushing massive vertebrae and causing severe, absolutely permanent nerve damage. Because her deeply chaotic personal life was already heavily tabloid fodder, the completely unsympathetic, highly vicious studio system completely washed their hands of her. They aggressively threw her entirely out onto the street, completely abandoning a severely disabled woman to incredibly mounting medical bills. Her once incredibly proud posture totally collapsed, and her walk devolved into a massive, highly painful limp. Desperate to simply survive the absolute, crushing agony of her broken back, she rapidly spiraled into severe, extremely heavy alcohol and substance addiction. By the incredibly tragic end of the 1960s, the former highly glamorous, massive Hollywood royalty was completely destitute, sleeping in incredibly filthy, highly dangerous flophouses and aggressively selling her body on the terrifying streets of Los Angeles. When she finally succumbed to absolute, total organ failure at the incredibly young age of 39, she died entirely alone, with absolutely nothing left but a completely shattered spine and a measly 55 cents in her bank account.